Bonjour, and I'd like to thank Professor Coulon for the invitation and the organizational committee for having this wonderful conference today here. I will talk about the concept of appropriateness, which is introduced to the Egyptological discourse, of course, by John Baines. We all know about it. I will sort of, let's say, flank this concept a little bit. I will repose it into a set of examples. So what we will do today is assigning, in the widest sense, rhetoric and a prominent cultural place in ancient Egypt by analyzing some of the relevant terminology, especially the term, which is also an Egyptian term, for appropriateness, or what John Baines has called decorum. Decorum and appropriateness relates quite naturally to the Egyptian court in the sense introduced like 5 minutes ago by Professor Coulon. And it might also include the first millennium. There are some examples from this time. Its direct relation to the religious discourse is not so obvious in my record, but of course, if it comes to the organization of the architectonical parts of late period temples, one can clearly see that it also works in this context quite well. My basic assumption is, and this is a little bit a larger context, that ancient Egypt is a rhetorical culture as such, and I'm saying this in the full awareness of Professor Coulon as one of the maîtres du rhétorique égyptien. What I mean is that we don't have, on a rhetorical language, verbal excellence level, terms of rhetorical amplification, but we have a canonical tradition that is it itself rhetorical, and that everything that we would term as style or reproductive style is basically at the heart a matter of rhetorical practice. This Egyptian concept of rhetorics operates not only in the realm of verbal rhetorics, but also on human bodies, including those of the king, on institutions, of course, on visual arts, there it comes from in the sense of John Baines, in architecture, and also in the heuristic discourse, which we wouldn't touch upon today. What I basically mean is that there is written evidence of a very consistent and often very self-reflexive rhetorical discourse, which, of course, in language communicates this transmedial validity of rhetorical principles, not only for language, but for art, for institutions, and for all organizational patterns. Basically, when I talk about rhetoric, as I said, I don't just talk about verbal excellence, but I have an understanding of rhetoric as a cultural system of amplification as such, not only rhetorical figures of amplification, but actually, as the German sociologist, another one, Niklas Luhmann once called it, the enhancement and intensivation of the effect of communication by generalization, which introduce the better and the more beautiful into communication. Basically, that's a matter of replication, of reuse, and of reproductive traditions, and that's basically what I understand. There are some, of course, some Egyptian terms that could relate to this identification of the concept, so Themen to strengthen, or Teruj to strengthen, Semenech to perfect. All these are kinds of conceptually bound terms that basically are considering forms of reuse, of reinterpretation, of redoing things. Wechem, to repeat, would be one of these more central terms in terms of a reproductive tradition. Wechem not only means repetition as such, to repeat, but also to implement, to reenact, or maybe even to perform what we just have done. Seni, to imitate, of course, we have the typical examples down here. We don't have to redo them again. To imitate, to emulate, and also substitute, to make alike, to make adequate, to perfect, or to match. So we have a sort of mixed internal realm of semantics to all these terms that basically are different kinds of perception, of processes, of imitating, of replicating, of redoing the tradition in a new but common form. Of course, the most clearly visible sign of this is the verbal rhetoric, the meted nephrit, which is maybe itself a eloquentia or a term for rhetoric. The chemut, the profession, which works for all arts, not only for verbal rhetoric, but it's a term that really goes through all the sorts of discourses. We just had the TAS, the fixed units of speech. It was also used in terms of the court organization in the Coffin Text 3 example just presented, which clearly shows that we have a rhetorical concept which does not only work in language, but is also a form of organizational pattern which sits rhetorically in court organization. So the metaphor is very clear, so I like this very much. These fixed units can be found, so they are there already. Yeah? They are standing, aha, tsas, aha, so you found them as fixed units of speech somewhere and you reuse it. And they can thus be broad, as Ptolemaic says, so you can reorganize existing things. There are moments, of course, comparable to what we know from the Greek discourse as kairos, the pregnant moment, so the fitting point in time, and there is the bodily part of it, which is also was reflected upon in the presentation of Professor Coulon. Aha chemset in one of the examples is basically what is conceptualized in the nemtet, the habitus or the conduct. And this is maybe a little bit different from what John Baines has done so far, I would also say that we have an Egyptian term for the concept of appropriateness and decorum, which I would see in the tp-ḥsb, which is just presented here. It was introduced in 1974 by John Baines, basically as a matter of description for the visual arts and what we see in Egyptian examples. Basically, the important point that John Baines just put down as early as in the middle of the 70s was that the decorum comments on the location. We will just see an example from the Temple of Dendera, which clearly exemplifies how close John Baines already in this first remark was on the analyzing the functions of decorum. What does he mean? The decorum is a set of rules and practices defining what may be represented, pictorially displayed, or possibly written down in which context and what form. It's related to etiquette. It's, of course, very clear. The rules of decorum, of what is fitting, appropriate, and necessary. A related concept is jar, the necessity, the need. To present and display in particular contexts are vital organizing features of ancient life. So basically, one can see that the range of what John Baines thinks the decorum does and how it is applied becomes bigger and bigger. What John Baines also said is that it does not follow that the Egyptians perceive it as a unity or elaborated it specifically as a system, and as a concept, decorum may not correspond to a single word. I would say we should be a little bit more optimistic about that. The origin of the concept is not coming from Alberti and the Renaissance theory of architecture, as what was the source of John Baines, but it's a classical rhetorical principle. You can always see it in Cicero, in Quintilian, and there is even a Greek precursor, the prepon. The central notion, as decorum is to reflect on the correct use of artistic devices in rhetoric, poetry, and fine art. Something is apt or appropriate exactly if something can be considered fitting from a specific perspective and in a given context. So that implies, of course, that the concept itself is fundamentally relational and it's elusive. You cannot fix it, although it's there and you can clearly see how it works. But as such, it is reflected not only in classical theory and classical rhetorical theory, but you can see also that it's reflected upon in the Egyptian discourse. As I said, I would be a little bit more optimistic. There is an Egyptian word for decorum, it's tp-ḥsb, and it's a discourse which shows that the word relates to a concept which was perceived as a transmedial system already traceable from at least 2000 BCE until 400 CE. So there is a clear continuity in the use, in the constant use of this word, this concept, throughout the Egyptian history, in the hieroglyphic record. My definition would be very abstract, that the decorum is a superior, transmedial, working on all media system, a principle to adjust those rules of decorum which enable an adequate form-giving process. Adequate object making is basically what it is all about. What we see, what we hear, what we have in terms of organizational patterns, in terms of bodies, in terms of everything. Relative, of course, to the media and the body involved. So the decorum on pictures is maybe different from the decorum in verbal rhetorics, but all in itself is adequate. And one thing is that it's allowing for change, although it seems to be stable, because the decorum, in terms of its adequacy theory, absorbs variance, and thus still is productive in terms of the reproductive tradition. The other thing is that the decorum, the tp-ḥsb, is not identical with the rules, the tebret or the chepu we talk about. It's an overarching principle that organizes the tebret and the chepu, the other terms and concepts of norms and rules and canons. It's a wonderful instrument to, as I said, to absorb variance over time. But basically, this observation of variance, on the other hand, makes cultural change, because it's basically what this system is all about. This principle to observe variance between modes and media, and especially over time, concerns our understandings of likeness, similarity, or artistic style, because the variance in style is basically still regulated as according to the appropriate. This principle thus recognizes objects in different social, medial, and historical constellation as appropriate, although they are different from each other, but they are still appropriate objects. These objects are meant to be perceived, so it's ma'a, these are seen, and the metaphor also works on language. Basically, it's about the conceptual visibility of things and forms, which is regulated by the objects. We can start, of course, with verbal rhetorics. It's pretty clear. I only begin with Ptahotep because here we can see that it's a self-reflexive process, talking about rhetorics as an instruction for the knowledge and towards the appropriateness of rhetorics. Medet nefret, tp-ḥsb, and medet nefret. What we can see here is that we have clearly a reproductive tradition in itself when the concept is outspoken like it is here. So basically, it's a form that works on itself by reproductive traditions. It's a form of repetition, or a system theoretically in the sociology, a re-entry of form into form. So basically, it's a matter of tautology, but this is how we make our world stable. It works on the body of the king. The body of the king, coming from a formative process of chnum, is formed according to the real appropriateness, the tp-ḥsb ma'at, of replicating setut as the image tit of Amun. So you can here clearly see that we have an idea of things, and the instance, one king or the next king, is a replicated image formed from considerations of appropriateness. And so every individual king remains an individual king, but what he basically incorporates is the idealized image of someone and something. And of course, here is the mythological figure of Atum. Yeah? And this works for every king in change over time. But still, you have this wonderful, ongoing system of appropriateness going through. It also works, of course, for the bodies of courtiers, and it's also always coupled with verbal excellence. We all know these Middle Kingdom examples. The appropriateness of conduct, tp-ḥsb and irid in the stila of radio chnum, and of course, perfectly conformable with courtiers, the seru. So he is integrated in the court culture by having this very, very special kind of divine body, one could say, divine to behold. So again, we have this divine example and the divine formation for individual bodies. There's also, of course, a more direct expression for people like these seru, these courtiers. They are men of appropriateness, si and tp-ḥsb. It works in the Ptolemaic period, but there are also Middle Kingdom examples. So we can see that it basically is a self-consideration of people who incorporate in their bodies and their body language and their verbal excellence all these kinds of different forms of appropriateness. It's also valid for institutions because these bodies are incorporated into what we know perfectly well, the ruid or the ararit, so the entrance hall, the institution which is central to making decisions. Also, this institution, the ruid, accords to appropriateness, and every habit is plumbed to measure. And of course, it's related to the way you use your body in this institutional context, which is formed to the same principles as your body language is, as a person, and as your verbal rhetoric is. So you have this concept working with individuals in institutional settings, and each of this is regulated by the concept of decorum. It goes so far that there is a relation between the tp-ḥsb and the tp-ret, not only in this late period cuboid of Neb-Netscheru, who said that he specifies the procedure, the tp-ret, the rules, in every work, even of unknown quality. But this is related to the central idea of appropriateness. So the tp-ret relates to overarching ideas of appropriateness or decorum. And tp-ret is the procedure, the rule, the regulation, the recipe. Basically, it's a form of procedure, but also related to the outcome, to the form, the end product of the procedure. So it's basically a relational term too. We have it for, as we would say, formal arts, the famous Stela of Irtisen, who knows that it's about the judgments of appropriateness. And this is why the concept of tp-ḥsb appropriateness is not fixed in terms of rules or regulations, but it's a matter of judgment, of knowledge, of restricted knowledge, of course, as John Baines would have said. Yeah, but still, these considerations are vital for the technical production, the living craft. Yeah? And this is probably the most dense of our examples. It's about the building description of Greco-Roman temples. Rhetorically, quite boring at the first glance. Basically, it's a summarizing statement concerning the perfect qualities of the overall design of a temple or one of its parts. It's standardized, mostly tripartite, sometimes bipartite, and it's a very, very parallelistic scheme. There are about 30 instances, which basically relate to object properties of Ptolemaic temples. The terms which we have are basically nefer, meta, and tp-ḥsb. Appropriateness, tp-ḥsb, is always and exclusively in the last position of these tripartite formula. This indicates a certain superiority over the other qualities, which can, to a certain degree, vary in their positions and can be discussed in a different manner. So there are three parts, ABC. The first one relates to a dimension or a part of architecture, which normally accords to perfection, nefer. The second dimension or part of architecture accords to the exemplary accuracy, meta. And the third part is the entirety of the temple. It's a form or Gestaltbegriff, the figure, accords to appropriateness. And there are different terms for having this sort of entirety, this entire form of the temple. It's either ichet es nebet or iru es neb, ket es, which is basically a term for the outer appearance of things, the form of bodies, and the tp-ret es neb. So every sort of what shall we say, the entire form or the entire procedures, the Gewerke in German, the production of it, is according to appropriateness. And here we can clearly see that these tp-ḥsb rules over tp-red. So that we have a rule that rules over rules. And this is basically the hidden motor of the rhetorical production of forms in ancient Egypt. This is an explicit communication, yeah? An understanding that rules and the forms which result from the application are based on superior considerations of appropriateness. This is the difference between tp-ḥsb and tp-red. Tp-red, as I just said, oscillates in meaning between the procedure, the rule, the regulation, or the recipe, also for Kifi, the orderliness and the layout, the ritual, even the gestalt or the form. It's also used for the Book of the Temple, of course, which is a tp-red. Also, Iru, as one of these gestalt terms at the end of the tripartite Ptolemaic formula, may either relate to an action or its visible result. So we can clearly see that in the record. And this is a wonderful example of how accurate John Baines' observation was already in 1974 when he said that the Decorum comments on this location. It's about the mirroring inscriptions in the room Q, or the Tresor of Dendera, where it said on the one hand that each part of it accords to appropriateness, tp-ḥsb, and then we have the discussion of the relation of the appropriateness design and the entire arrangement tp-red. Splendid in its execution and magnificent in its entire arrangement. And it is mirrored by the discussion on the opposite wall where it said that its entire arrangement, tp-red, accords to the place where it belongs. And that's basically the principle of appropriateness. One has to know where things belong. And then everything, every regulation, every outer form comes to the place where it is needed. And this is basically what John Baines meant when he said that the Decorum comments on its own location. So if we conclude, we would say that any material and non-material forms in ancient Egypt, including practices, forms of organizations, institutions, procedures, royal and not so royal bodies are likely governed by quite elusive considerations of appropriateness. It's not very explicit. The only explicit examples we have do not tell us what the concept of appropriate is all about. It's simply there, and it can be quoted. It can be related to in terms of an explanation of why things are as they are. In the end, rhetorical reproduction thus produces a concrete familiarité with the world, which at the same time remains sort of undefined by concrete rules, as it is nevertheless distinguished from unfamiliar forms of communications in whatever medium. And this is what Netscheru just addressed. Yeah? Even if it's about unknown qualities of things, Decorum works. So basically, that's the pattern which organizes even the unknown, the future, the change in ancient Egypt. And that's basically it for the moment. I hope I can discuss it with you now in terms of questions and answers. Thanks.